Hi everyone. Welcome back to English Fab, where learning English is practical, useful, and fab. Today, we're going to talk about ought to, a useful phrase for giving advice, expressing obligations, making predictions, and even talking about past regrets. Many English learners find ought to confusing because it sounds similar to should, but there are key differences that can help you use it more naturally. In this lesson, we'll break down the different ways to use ought to with clear explanations, practical examples, and important tips to help you avoid common mistakes. This lesson follows the grammar introduced on our English Fab website, so you can review key points anytime. If you find English difficult, don't worry. You can translate the subtitles into English and your own language like this. Check the description below for extra details.
So, let's get started.
In this section, we'll explore 4 common ways to use ought to with clear explanations and examples.
Let's get started.
1. Giving advice or recommendations. Use ought to when suggesting what is the right or best thing to do. It is a polite way to give advice or encouragement. Example: you ought to drink more water for your health. This means drinking water is a good choice and is beneficial for health. More examples: you ought to sleep earlier if you feel tired. He ought to take a break after working all day. If you want to give advice in a gentle and formal way, ought to is a great phrase to use. 2. Expressing moral or social obligations. Use ought to when talking about responsibilities, duties, or ethical behavior. It often refers to what people should do in society. Example: people ought to respect each other. This means it is the right thing to do, and everyone should follow it. More examples: employees ought to be honest in their work. Children ought to listen to their parents. If something is a moral or social expectation, ought to expresses it well. 3. Expressing probability or expectation. Use ought to when describing something that is likely or expected to happen. It shows that something is very probable based on logic or common sense. Example: the train ought to arrive soon. This means based on the schedule or expectation, the train should arrive shortly. More examples: she ought to be home by now. This movie ought to be interesting based on the reviews. If something is expected to happen, ought to is a natural way to express it. 4. Talking about past regrets with have. Use ought to have when talking about things that should have happened in the past but didn't. This is useful for expressing regret or missed opportunities. Example: I ought to have studied harder for the exam. This means I didn't study enough and now I regret it. More examples: she ought to have told the truth instead of lying. We ought to have left earlier to avoid traffic. If you want to talk about past mistakes or regrets, ought to have is a useful structure. Now that we've covered the different ways to use ought to, let's go over some important tips to help you use it naturally and correctly in conversations. 1. Ought to versus should. Many learners wonder about the difference between ought to and should. Ought to is slightly more formal and often used when talking about moral responsibilities, social expectations, or strong recommendations. Example: you ought to apologize to her. This sounds more formal or serious. Should is more neutral and used in everyday advice. Example: you should apologize to her. This sounds more casual and common. Both ought to and should express advice or recommendations, but ought to sounds a bit stronger in some situations. 2. Always use to after ought. Unlike must or should, ought always requires to before the verb. Correct: you ought to be more careful. Incorrect: you ought be more careful. More examples: she ought to call her parents more often. They ought to study for the exam. If you use ought in a sentence, always follow it with to before the verb. 3. Use ought to for expectations and predictions. Use ought to when talking about something that is expected to happen based on logic or reasoning. Example: this plan ought to work well. It is expected to succeed. More examples: he ought to be here by now. He is expected to arrive. The weather ought to be nice tomorrow. It is likely to be good. If something is likely to happen based on facts or reasoning, ought to is a great way to express it. 4. Use ought not to for negatives. The negative form of ought to is ought not to. In British English, it is sometimes shortened to oughtn't. Example: You ought not to be rude to others. It is wrong to be rude. More examples. He ought not to waste so much time. We ought not to ignore safety rules. If you want to advise against something, use ought not to. 5. Practice common phrases with ought to. Here are some popular expressions using ought to that you can practice. You ought to see a doctor. Giving strong advice. We ought to leave soon. It is a good idea to go now. She ought to have told us earlier. Regret about the past. Try making your own sentences with ought to reinforce your understanding. Great job. Now you understand how to use ought to give advice, talk about obligations, express expectations, and even discuss past regrets. Whether you're telling someone what they ought to do, explaining what ought to happen, or reflecting on what ought to have been done, this phrase is a great way to sound more natural in English. To improve even more, try making a few sentences using ought to in different situations. Think about a piece of advice you'd give to a friend, something you expect to happen soon, or even a regret from the past. Practicing these phrases will help you use them fluently in conversations. Okay, thanks for watching today's lesson on English Fab. I hope you found these English tips useful and feel more confident. Remember, practice makes perfect, so try using these phrases in your daily conversations. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more Fab English lessons. Until next time, keep practicing and stay fab.